Last month, as another 30 days of war passed in Ukraine, Russian activists, economists, and politicians in the exiled anti-Kremlin opposition spent much of their time arguing about a banking scandal from the last decade. The debate has been as mystifying to outsiders as it is confusing to those of us without an education in finance. If you've never heard of Probusinessbank, here's a brief overview. Alexander Zhelezniak and Sergei Leontiev founded it in 1993. After surviving Russia's 1998 financial crisis, they expanded the network, acquiring several regional banks and merging them in 2006 to form Life Group. By the early 2010s, Life Group was Russia's fifth largest banking network in branch size, and Probusinessbank alone was among the country's top 50 banks. And then it all came crashing down. In August 2015, Russia's central bank revoked Probusinessbank's license. 2 months later, officials declared it bankrupt. The day Probusinessbank lost its license, the central bank calculated its liquidity gap to be at least 67 billion rubles, roughly $1 billion at the time. If you've heard anything about Probusinessbank or its founders lately, it was probably in connection with that dispute among Vladimir Putin's public enemies that I mentioned a moment ago. That started in early October when Maxim Katz, a former municipal deputy turned popular YouTuber, released a 2-hour investigative video accusing Alexei Navalny's Anti-Corruption Foundation, or ACF as I'll be referring to it several times today, of laundering the reputations of Zhelezniak and Leontiev in exchange for large donations and administrative help. Zhelezniak served as the treasurer of ACF's international operations until his resignation after Katz's investigation in late October. After 3 weeks of pretty much constant cyberspace combat between both sides and their supporters, the Anti-Corruption Foundation responded with its own whopper of a YouTube video, a 96-minute dissection of Katz's storytelling omissions and a denial that Zhelezniak and Leontiev stole any money at all. The Foundation's rebuttal focused on tearing down errors and manipulations in Katz's investigation, but Zhelezniak and Leontiev's return to the news agenda has also refocused journalists and experts on what ostensibly drives the dispute in the first place, namely the actual events and practices at Probusinessbank. So let's talk about the criminal stakes at the heart of the scandal involving Probusinessbank, and yes, let's break down some of the opposition politics and the anti-corruption ethical dilemma that makes these bankers such a headache all over again. Welcome to the Naked Pravda. Howdy, folks. Welcome back to the podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Rothrock, the managing editor of Medusa in English. To understand how banking practices from the last decade erupted into an opposition scandal last month, the first thing you need to know is that the Anti-Corruption Foundation, in some ways, got this ball rolling, ruffling the feathers of fellow oppositionists, particularly those in camps outside Team Navalny's orbit, when it argued earlier this year in a YouTube miniseries called Traitors that many of the businessmen now instrumental in funding anti-Kremlin activities are responsible for lifting Putin to power in the first place and for betraying Russia's post-Soviet democratic prospects. Then in September, the team published evidence suggesting that former oil executive Leonid Nevzlin, the purse behind several media outlets and a close ally of Mikhail Khodorkovsky, had recruited thugs to attack members of the Anti-Corruption Foundation, possibly even to kidnap one and hand him over to Russian federal agents. In this context, ACF supporters say that Maxim Katz is merely acting as a hired gun against an organization that is causing trouble for the corrupt, moneyed interests who wrap themselves in anti-Kremlin credentials. In this sense, the response mirrors Katz's allegations against ACF. So they've each got that going for them. Now, to learn more about Katz's work, I welcomed back to the show Ilya Shumanov, the General Director of Transparency International Russia in Exile.
Maxim Katz, I suppose, published this story because of the pressure of the people who lost money in this bank and who tried to trace asset of the former top managers and the owner of this bank. And this is a group of the people, the people who lost their money, they're still willing to return some money from Zhelezniak and Leontiev. And they're trying to find their assets all over the world. And they traced a lot, like 5 or 7 years in the process of the litigation in the several jurisdictions, such as, for example, in Liechtenstein. They tried to start the court cases in Poland, in the United States, and other jurisdictions. But now they, let's say, focus on Liechtenstein specifically because there is still option to return their money to those who lost their money in the Probusinessbank. And it was only the one scheme, because there were other schemes in the Probusinessbank that possibly led to disappearance of this money from the capital of the bank. There were more ugly schemes like technical loans for the shell companies that used globally, not only in Russia, but as a, let's say, very, very easy way to funnel money from any bank without any explanation. And there was also schemes related to, like Probusinessbank was the one of the bank in the group of the financial group Life that included 7 different banks, and Probusinessbank was the center of this group. And there was a scheme of providing loans from one bank to another. It was a bank circle. This bank loaned each other, and it was very complicated for the central bank to, let's say, to trace the real capital of any bank, because with some of this loan were technical, and it's also the scheme of falsification of the reporting process of the capital of this bank by the top managers of this group Life.
As you've said, the investigation seems to be motivated by people involved in this story, people that essentially lost money to these 2 bankers who managed to make so much of money on their own and then leave Russia. Does the Katz investigation rely on documents or records that were not previously available? Was he and his team given new information, or is this just an old story that he managed to make new again?
I suppose that previously these facts, I have never heard about the publication of this data because of a specific transaction that appears in Maxim Katz's revelation, let's say.
So he
Yeah.
got access to new documents.
Yes, new documents, and I suppose that these documents were provided by this group of the customers of this bank who lost their money. Yeah, and actually I put my eye on this bank during the collapse of this bank in like 2015 to 2017. And that time there was no such facts like Maxim Katz provided to his audience. And of course, there was no specific data related to this complicated scheme of the loans, subordinate loans, and the transaction between offshore companies and back to Russian companies. And of course, it was not possible to, let's say, to identify the scheme in 2016, 2017, and something like that. But because of the activity of mostly the court action that initiated by these customers of Probusinessbank, they succeeded and they received several documents that was not publicly available previously. And these materials were provided to Maxim Katz. He published this. And of course, we can discuss the accuracy of this data because there was a lot of critics who highlighted that Maxim Katz was not very accurate during his investigation because some of the data was redacted. And
what's an example of like one of the kind of misleading things that Katz did in his investigation?
Actually, she published only the half of the story, like the withdrawal money from the bank and funneling out of the Russia. But there was a process of the providing these subordinate loans, at least in dozen million of dollars from this 470 millions that returned to Probusinessbank through these companies affiliated with top managers of these banks. And this is very essential part of the story that gives us the idea of not on of stealing maybe the whole amounts of money, but the falsification of the capital and balance sheet of this bank.
Katz claims that the two bankers stole at least $470 million from Probusinessbank through a network of brokerage firms, offshore accounts, and subordinated loans. According to the Katz investigation, bank funds were placed in the accounts of foreign and Russian brokers and then transferred to offshores controlled by Zhelezniak and Leontiev. To conceal their connection to the enterprises receiving the money, the bankers registered the offshores to random people and paid them a pittance to pose in paperwork as the owners. Zhelezniak and Leontiev then used the money for personal enrichment, playing the stock market and saddling Probusinessbank's clients with the risks. They funneled their winnings through a chain of companies, for example, into Leontiev's trust, which was registered in the Cook Islands. ACF's response to the allegations that Zhelezniak and Leontiev stole almost $500 million from Probusinessbank rests on the logic that most of the money was ultimately returned to enterprises under the umbrella of Life Group. Team Navalny reasons that the bankers resorted to moving the money around in such Byzantine ways to evade onerous Russian regulations that arguably suppressed private capital. Here's how Georgy Alburov, one of ACF's leading researchers, defended the setup. Actually, his tone here reminded me of a certain Hollywood classic. See if you can guess which one.
In short, Maxim and experts who sympathize with his investigation, that's where the 470 million went. The vast majority of it went back to Life Group's companies, redirected to Probusinessbank's sister structures, like a debt collection agency, a factoring service, and real estate development projects. Life Group was building townhouses and apartments in the Moscow region.
You're thinking of this place all wrong, as if I had the money back in a safe. The money's not here. Well, your money's in Joe's house. That's right next to yours. And in the Kennedy house, and Mrs. Maitland's house, and 100 others. You're lending them the money to build, and then they're going to pay it back to you as best they can. Now, what are you going to do, foreclose on them?
Shumanov told me that ACF researchers' inability to locate all the funds withdrawn from Probusinessbank is telling. He said he found even less money accounted for in his own search of the bank's records on subordinated debt, the riskier loans issued to Zhelezniak and Leontiev's offshores. Shumanov also challenges ACF's claim that money transferred to offshore companies and later returned to sister structures in Life Group actually constitutes a return of the bank's funds.
Yeah, look, I suppose at that time that we are talking about that Maxim Katz published this investigation, it was like approximately 2012, 2014. There was a, let's say, hole in the balance of this bank, like deficit in this bank. And actually, the founders and shareholders of this bank and top managers, they are looking for some capital that could be increase the balance, because there was, since central bank installed a new regulation related to the, let's say, capital and the amounts of this capital. Yeah, and central bank intensively supervised the whole bank and tried to identify the falsification of the reporting process and the falsification of the balance in any bank. And during that time, some of the amounts of the capital of this bank was deposited in the brokerage account in Russian brokers and international brokers, UK brokerage company. And as I mentioned, in fact, these assets were reflected on the bank accounts twice. The first time when deposits were deposited on the brokerage accounts and reflected on the balance sheet in Probusinessbank, and the second time in the form of subordinate loans that was deposited by or provided by companies that are related to these banksters, but not to the real bank affiliated companies. It was done because actually this means that banksters falsified bank statements. They actually use this money twice. The first time they was, let's say, mentioned and as subordinate loans and appeared in the bank balance. And the second one, they appeared as deposits of the brokerage account and also put it on the bank balance. This is a criminal activity, of course, and that time in 2014, there was specific criminal article in Russian penal code about the falsification of the financial statements on bank. And every individual who said that actually there is no criminal in this activity, everybody did this. I mean, every banksters and every top managers of the bank did this. Of course, no. And we know that because of this criminal article. The bank managers, they actually created the parallel system of a dozen of the companies and different companies in Russia, not only in offshore jurisdiction in Cyprus, but in Russia. And actually, these corporate structures, I mean, different companies, shell companies, they were headed by the bank employees, and they received additional salary for this work. And actually, the main part of the work, they falsified reporting, and they were used as, let's say, managers who withdraw money from bank, who issued loans in favor of the top managers of the bank and actually the shareholders of the bank. And this specific department that exists in Probusinessbank and who was responsible for this legal operation, it was called Valkyria.
So I know that their response was that, oh, like you said, Kotz gave half the story. In fact, the money came back, and therefore you can't say it was stolen. But as I understand it, the sort of financial analysis here is that not all the money came back. We could only account for some of it. So there's still, hundreds of millions of dollars that, as far as we know, is just gone. But the money that did come back, in fact, came back to businesses that are merely owned or controlled by Leontiev and Zheleznyk. So if you were a client of Probusinessbank, whoop-de-doo, it's now owned by some other company. This money was somehow paid back to another company, but your savings are gone. Is that correct? So in that sense, we're still talking very much about embezzlement, but there's somehow this is better. Why exactly does this look better than an outright theft? Is, I guess, my question.
Yeah, I don't think it's better.
And why did they return it at all?
That...
Why did the money come back at all? Why is that just a way of making it look more legitimate to regulators? Like I guess, as you said, it's a lot of the money. Certainly this is this is the Anti-Corruption Foundation's main argument is that the money came back, but it came back to different places. Why was it returned at all? This is because the scheme involved subordinate loans, which meant that there was still debts to be repaid, and so some of that money was repaid. Could you explain for me, just the difference here between outright theft and what happened?
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, the banksters, Leontiev and Zheleznyk, they try to, let's say, to provide their own picture, like there was no stealing of this money, that it was legitimate money that they received now, and let's say deposited on their bank accounts. Although there is a big difference between banks' money and their own money, and actually the customers, they try to, let's say, they insist that there is a correlation between this money that deposited on the personal bank accounts of the top managers of Probusinessbank and the hole in the balance of Probusinessbank. Now, yes, you're absolutely right. In context of there is no difference, but I mean there is a big difference between the money that was transferred from the bank account through the complicated scheme of the offshore companies and the money that was deposited on the bank accounts of Probusinessbank by some offshore companies. Not the same. It's not the bank's money anymore. This is the money belong to the specific offshore companies. And this is a big, I suppose, inaccuracy in the FBK investigation. But some of these amounts, there was, let's say, provided to bank through the subordinate loans, and they appeared in the balance of this bank. Of course, it means some of the money is still, let's say, of course, it was a falsified statements published by the bank, but still this money somehow appeared. And this part actually have never appeared in the Max Katz investigation. But for the, let's say, for for the audience, it's essential that could say that this money somehow returned to Russia, but not disappeared somewhere in the offshore industry.
I saw that Yulia Latinina, who I know is a very colorful character, she described this as robbing a bank one day and then the next day showing up and with that exact amount of money and opening a savings account. So that in that regard, you still robbed the bank, but the money's still there. Is that a fair analogy, or is that oversimplify it?
Yeah, it's very simplification, of course. Yeah, but in general, for the audience, it will be very, very, let's say, correct. Let's say
Okay.
in general.
When Probusinessbank lost its license, that was part of a campaign by the central bank in the mid-2010s to clean up the banking industry in Russia. The initiative targeted captive banks where shareholders diverted money from bank coffers to their own pockets. Shumanov told Meduza that Zheleznyak and Leontiev used Probusinessbank in exactly this way. And when state investigators opened a criminal case against the two bankers and began questioning other bank managers that they'd left behind in Russia, they discovered a parallel system of dozens of different companies, codenamed Valkyrie, that were created to falsify financial statements and move funds out of the bank. Now, much of the evidence for this illicit system admittedly comes from testimonies given by suspects held in Russian jails, but the accounts are detailed, and Zheleznyak and Leontiev even disclosed to journalist Andrei Zayakin that they ran a separate department to conceal asset withdrawals. According to Zayakin, in interviews he conducted in 2020, Zheleznyak and Leontiev said they raised more than $300 million by selling high-return promissory notes issued by companies affiliated with Probusinessbank, doing little to hide that most of the deposits collected were undeclared money, literally suitcases full of cash from persons with direct ties to state prosecutors. In fact, the officials whose money Probusinessbank apparently laundered even include former Prosecutor General Yuri Chaika, who was the focus of a bombshell ACF investigation in December 2015. In response to Katz, the Anti-Corruption Foundation acknowledged that Avalon car dealership company beneficiaries used Probusinessbank to stash the Prosecutor General's slush fund. To be honest, I find it utterly repulsive, ACF chairwoman Maria Pevchik told viewers in the organization's 90-minute YouTube video. However, Pevchik argued that Zheleznyak and Leontiev's dealings with corrupt officials don't mean that the bankers aren't the victims of the Putin regime's political persecution. It is political, but not in the way we're used to, said Pevchik, claiming that Zheleznyak and Leontiev were persecuted not for their beliefs, but for refusing to share the spoils.
There were several clients, such as, for example, Avalon Group you have mentioned, and this was VIP clients that actually had the privilege to use specific type of operation in this bank. They easily access to loans. They received loans in big amounts of money without any obligations. And it looks like that these loans and the services that we provided by Probusinessbank were directly connected to the amounts of cash that Avalon Group and connected with this group individuals deposited on the Probusinessbank. And there is an investigation done by Andrei Zayakin, the well-known Russian investigative reporter, who published this story several weeks after publication, done by Maxim Katz, who accused the Probusinessbank top managers in laundering cash for general prosecutors. I don't know how it's called in English, Общак of general prosecutor's office and high-rank officials, top high-rank individuals from general prosecutor office and their families. They deposited allegedly corrupt money in Probusinessbank, and top managers of Probusinessbank laundered this money for them.
And literally, they brought the money in like suitcases and bags, right? Like cash. It's like something out of a movie or cartoon.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah, and yeah, you have mentioned the cash boxes and these guys that deposited this money without any compliance, and of course it was black cash, allegedly corrupted. We can say that it could be, let's say, only hypothesis done by published by Andrei Zayakin. But from the other hand, we can let's say we can see the official statement that is done during the criminal court process in Russia, and there are some top managers of the bank, not the top managers, but the middle managers of this bank, who were accused in the fraud as well as top managers, but they stayed in Russia during this process, and they were accused, they were imprisoned because of this allegation, and they did several statements during this process. And these individuals, I mean, managers of this bank, they said that yes, there was a specific scheme of depositing money by general prosecutors and connected with Avalon Group. And actually, this money was from unknown sources. And the guys from our group of Avalon, Kavo Vagumian, he is one of the owners of this company, and he has close connection with the general prosecutor's office. And during the procurement procedures, general prosecutor's office bought the number of cars from Kavo Avagumian company Avalon, and they interconnected not only on the procurement level, but also on the family level. Some of the relatives of Kavo Vagumian, they were also married, and also they worked for general prosecutor's office. So this is a very close interconnection between general prosecutor's office and Avalon Group gave the possibility for Kavo Vagumian to communicate with Probusinessbank as a, let's say, ambassador from this general prosecutor's office group. And of course, he could be the person who deposited money as intermediaries in favor of general prosecutor's office, especially, let's say, several deputy general prosecutors.
Before his arrest in April 2019, Kirill Cherkalin was the fast-rising, well-connected head of the FSB Economic Security Directorate's enormously powerful Bank Crimes Division. A few weeks after his arrest, he sought a plea deal, and in a signed statement, he reportedly named a powerful retired FSB general who allegedly provided protection to several credit organizations during his service. Months later, by accident or on purpose, information leaked to the press that Cherkalin testified that most of the 12 billion rubles, that's B for billion, discovered at his apartments in police raids actually belonged to Valery Miroshnikov, the former deputy head of the Deposit Insurance Agency, Russia's state corporation responsible for various insolvency procedures. Miroshnikov, incidentally, fled the country immediately after Cherkalin's arrest. So, what was going on here? According to reporting by journalist Irek Murtazin, Miroshnikov, Cherkalin, and others learned about roughly 2 trillion rubles, more than $20.6 billion in today's currency, in capital shortfalls that Russian banks accumulated between 2013 and 2017. And then they offered the bank's owners a grace period of several months to purge their records, transfer money to foreign accounts, flee the country, and then pose abroad as victims of the regime. All this in exchange for massive kickbacks, up to 30% of the size of individual institutions' capital shortfalls. The state then stepped in and rescued or restructured these banks at taxpayers' expense. And of course, the Cherkalin story overlaps with our Probusinessbank drama. Alexander Zheleznyak says Cherkalin offered him protection in 2014. Can you explain to me where the FSB and maybe even the MVD fits in? Because they ended up arresting several of these FSB guys and charging them with corruption, and it led to years of prosecution and so on. How does that fit into this?
Look, we have to mention for the audience one fact that there is several supervisors of the bank industry in Russia. The one is central bank, and another one is law enforcement. The main regulator is actually FSB and Department K in FSB. And there was a huge scandal in Russia, corruption scandal related to the high-rank officers in this department who supervised Russian bank industry for years. And actually, during the investigation against this Department K, some of them they were imprisoned because of the corruption and embezzlement connected with the bank industry. Like they blackmailed some banksters, they blackmailed some people from this industry, and in exchange of receiving benefits from them, it was, let's say, long-term communication, long-term schemes connected to the main banks in Russia. And actually, the FSB plays a great role in this supervision, unofficial supervision of Russian banking industry. And you have mentioned that Probusinessbank was one of the banks that was targeted by these FSB officers in 2012 or 14. And it could be possible because every bank during this period struggled with central bank regulation, because there was a new head of central bank appeared, Elvira Nabiulina, who decided to clean Russian bank industry, and more than 160 banks lost their licenses because the most part of this bank was captive bank, and they was not real bank, but they, let's say, provided some service, unofficial service to withdraw money or to launder money, to funnel this money out of the Russia, and there was no non-compliance with Russian or international regulation. And I suppose that Probusinessbank was in the same situation, and that's why they were contacted by FSB to provide the roof, like Krisha, for this bank. And it could be possible. And during the court process in the United States, Mr. Zhelezniak and Leontiev, they mentioned that they were contacted by FSB, and afterwards, this story appeared in the Russian media, investigative media project, who mentioned this story of the communication between FSB and Mr. Zhelezniak. And it looks like that this story could be real for me, as I mentioned, because of the collapse of bank industry in 2012, 2014, just before the situation when the Probusinessbank lost its license.
By this point, you might be asking yourself, who cares if Alexander Zhelezniak and Sergei Leontiev qualify as victims of political repression? After all, what's one more ethical dilemma for the increasingly irrelevant Russian opposition in exile? Well, the issue also has been at the center of major litigation. Reporting by The Bell shows that the two bankers have won foreign lawsuits time and again, thanks largely to Western courts' fundamental distrust of Russia's justice and regulatory systems. It has been especially easy for Zhelezniak and Leontiev with European and American judges because many of the Russian officials who investigated Probusinessbank are also implicated in the death of tax advisor Sergei Magnitsky, whose case obviously has become an international rallying cry and a horror story that, as the Financial Times put it, encapsulates the darker side of Putinism. Thanks for tuning in, folks. This has been The Naked Pravda, a podcast from Meduza in English. Remember that undesirable status back in Russia means our entire news outlet now relies on readers and listeners around the world to support our work. Please visit our website for information about how to become a contributor with one-time or recurring pledges. Thanks again. Until next week.